All right. Well, welcome to our very first show of Beacon of Hope. My name is Brian Hamilton. I am a therapist associate at My Serenity Mental Wellness in Rancho Cucamonga. I'm here with Aaron Carranza and Lee King. So why don't the two of you go ahead and introduce yourselves?
My name is Erin Carranza. I am the founder of Transformation Through Reunification. I'm a CPS coach. I help parents fight back. I have also been victimized by PCFS. They removed my child illegally without a warrant, based on false accusations. Got her back in dependency court, and now I'm fighting in family court, which is a whole different monster.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Lee. I'm a former foster youth. I run a charity called Rising with Hope, where I send out packages and offer mentorship for youth. I'm also a content creator and talk about some ways that foster parents can better navigate trauma informed. And I try to help biological families through their rights from the system as well.
Okay. So we wanted to do this show because for those of you who don't remember, Aaron and I used to do a show called Real Victims of CPS. And we wanted to kind of start this show to talk about some additional issues that were in the foster care system. And one of the things that I thought would be a good starting place would be to kind of talk about how we got here, because it is quite the sordid history of how the foster care system, what its origins were, how it kind of developed some of the strategies that they use, and so I kind of wanted to talk about starting with way back in 1601 with the poor laws, which I don't know if the two of you are familiar with these or not.
I think I am, but I think maybe you should give a brief history for people that
Okay.
are not. Or
Yeah. So what it was happening at that period of time was that the was that in 1536 they had basically dissolved the Catholic Church, and so a lot of the parishes that were bringing in income to be used for charitable contributions to the poor basically dissolved with that. And as a result, there was this growing issue where the poor um, were struggling because they just didn't have that same financial stream that they had before. So in 1601, they created the Poor Laws, which were essentially designed to provide like food, clothing, and shelter to the poor. It was still being implemented largely through the church, um, and um, and that was basically the start of all of this. And there were some obvious problems that very quickly came up, because a lot of what they were starting to run into was that this was a period of time when like work in agriculture was really plummeting. Like it was at a point where, like at the beginning of a lot of this, it was about 60% of the population was employed through agriculture. They were basically farmers, or working on farmed land. And by the 1700s, it basically had fallen from like about 60% of people like were working in agriculture to about 20%. And all of those people who were unemployed didn't really have any place to go except to get um,
Just
services, yeah, through the poor laws. And by the 18th century, they were starting to the poor laws were really starting to come under criticism. I'm guessing, have the two of you ever read Swift's A Modest Proposal?
no.
Okay. So his modest proposal was basically that he was noting the fact that there were a lot of people that were in poverty and that poverty seemed to be an increasing problem. And so his modest proposal was to basically put poor people onto farms and use them as kind of like cattle that they would use for food. So it was it was satirical, but it was kind of pointing at the fact that there was this conversation that was happening on one hand where it was like we're really concerned about people, but there was also this kind of like inhumanity to the way that they were trying to address the poor. So this was already a problem by I think this was in 1729 when wrote this. But his proposal, even though it was satirical, started getting followed by actual serious conversations about it. Like there was a guy named Malthus in 1795. He was a parishioner, and he had basically suggested that the increase in provided resources to the poor was actually increasing their population, and that in order to reduce poverty, what we needed to do was be much more, I don't know, kind of like Machiavellian in terms of who got what.
Well, it's
And
funny
yeah,
that you're talking about that is that they still cannot separate being poor and child abuse. It still goes in hand in hand. If you're poor, then automatically you're abusing your children. And that's not the case. Poverty and child abuse are not the same thing.
So this is something I like to reiterate a lot. Okay, so when we're looking at neglect and poverty, so neglect would be the willful action of a parent who has the ability to access resources and chooses not to. But most of the time, the issues are poverty, which is a family.
yes, it looks like Lee froze there for a second. But kind of to just reiterate what she was
It's
saying is
not intentful. This is not something that they're choosing. This is something that's happened to them, and they don't have the resources.
right. And this was actually the thing that you're talking about, the fact that they are basically using poverty as a sign of neglect was coming out of this period of time in the 1830s, 1800s, and sorry, the 1700s and 1800s. They started trying to talk about this idea that poverty was the result of a lack of moral character, which is why we today kind of a lot of times equate poverty with neglect, which is kind of what you're saying. Um, and so basically what they were suggesting in 1834, they made big revisions to the poor laws, where they cut back on what they called outdoor relief. And this was basically direct relief that went to families, to help pay for things like food, shelter, clothing, and instead focused more on what was called workhouse relief, which was that they would basically force individuals to work in what are called workhouses, to receive services. And the conditions in these places were deliberately poor in order to basically prevent people and discourage people from seeking services, and basically being what they considered a drain on society, like because of their moral depravity. And it was also around this time that they started taking kids and placing them with families, because they felt that what they wanted to do is they wanted to remove the kids until their families were, essentially morally proper, morally prudent, and could be able to um, uh, provide like a real Christian upbringing for their kids. So
Right.
that's where a lot of this was coming from, and that's where a lot of this kind of like almost like moral underpinning that happens within CPS first started, was right back then in like 1834.
And
So
let's not forget that everything you've explained so far also has a religious undertone to some of those programs, which I think is a factor as well.
and it was interesting, like Erin and I were discussing this before the show, and she mentioned like that it was kind of strange um, that they were considering being in poverty a moral failing. And why don't you talk about that, Erin? Because I thought that was such a great point.
Well, it's crazy to me that people are kept poor. There's you we when you go through dependency court, when you go through having your children removed, they put on so many restrictions and you have to do so much stuff that it's almost impossible for you to keep a full-time job. At one point, I had 6 different classes, and it was like scattered all throughout the day. And then you have random drug testing, and you better be here in 30 minutes. And so everything that they do is designed to keep you down. There is no there's no real reunification. I haven't seen any bringing children back home with their families.
Mhm.
Um, Everything just seems like it is absolutely designed to keep you poor, to keep you in
Mhm.
separation. And
To keep their funding coming through
right,
for those
right.
programs.
Right. And again, it's that idea that giving money to the poor to provide assistance while you're having to do things like the classes and going to court hearings and trying to uh, find find employment while at the same time having a mark on your record.
Well, and the funny thing is that it's all you said. It's all religiously based. I don't know what happened to the separation of church and state. It's like being
Yes.
eroded right now, but it's not very Christian of them to do what they're doing to these families, to turn their back on them, to take their children away, to punish them for being poor or whatever. When you look down your nose at somebody because they don't have what you have,
Mhm.
it's offensive.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think yeah, there was a comment you made about like in our earlier conversation. I know you don't remember now, but was you said, well, it kind of goes against what the Bible says in
Right.
regards to blessed are the poor,
And the little children. Right.
and
Listen.
they're the ones that will inherit the kingdom of God. It's kind of like,
Mhm.
okay, well, I
Yeah.
kind of
And
get where
that's
you're
why
coming.
it kills me that they claim to be, religious and following the Bible and the preachings of Jesus. And I'm like, wait, no, no, no. Let's not do that here. But if you're going to do that, let's actually do it because you're not.
But it basically what happened was after they started making these revisions of the poor laws in the UK, those philosophies started to influence what was happening here in the United States. And so, for example, around like 1830, there was this big outbreak of disease that was happening on the East Coast, and like a lot of the kids, um, whose parents died from things like typhoid and the flu, were left orphaned. And so, during that time, there was an organization that was founded that was called the Children Aid Society. It was founded by a minister named Charles Loring Brace. Um, they basically started providing housing for these for the poor, but kind of based on this idea of like they needed to be productive citizens. He started a small program initially in 1855 where he sent like 45 kids out to families to basically provide um, to kind of apprentice with them,
Mhm.
and to learn to become farmers. But by between 1855 and 1875, that program ballooned from 45 children to about 3,000 uh, children over the course of those 20 years that were shipped off to farmers in the Midwest to act as farm hands, essentially. And a lot of those families were not properly interviewed, which probably sounds very familiar, and so abuse was rampant. And it was also kind of the beginning of what was called the orphan train system. I don't know if either of you have ever heard of this.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, talk about it, Lee.
So the orphan train system, they ship the children from one side of the United States to the other. A lot of odd adoptions also came out of this, but like you said, they were being more used at this point for servitude than they were looking for homes from them. And this happened quite often. I mean, children of all ages, trains filled with children, but also speaking just on a racial matter, a lot of Black children were also on those trains. They were more easily taken from their families and sent elsewhere to, again, be more of an asset, a hand to them, or a maid. They were kind of looking like, oh, this is very simple. We'll get these kids and then we can use them for servitude. And they should be grateful for the things that we're giving them. That might
That's
not.
the part that gets me. It's like, we're going to enslave you and you better be happy about it.
And it's funny you mentioned that because that's big part of what drove this was because in 1865 that was the end of the Civil War, and that was also the end of slavery. And so a lot of these families were looking to like the orphan trains and to like the Children Aid Society to basically provide them with cheap labor because they no longer had like a population of slaves to do it for them.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so that's also how a big part of the foster care system got started. Was basically, it wasn't about the children, it was about the families that they were being put with. And you can still kind of hear that rhetoric a lot of times, with foster parents who will sometimes tell their the kids that are in their care that the only reason that they're there is because they need the money, and so they're using the kids as a way of basically um, um, to
On their
exploit them
lifestyle.
for money. Yeah, yeah,
Their
yeah,
kids, a maid, or their income. They count the money they get as income, instead of that's not what the money is supposed to be for. But also I wanted to highlight something you said that kind of showed a stark difference. So in the beginning, the idea was okay, and those first 45 kids possibly did actually get taught agriculture and things. But when we open up the door and we have a floodgate, we have to equally have a floodgate of people, which crunches us on time to find good people. And then we start going, I don't care, we just need to put them somewhere. And that's where we start seeing, okay, now we're accepting this, we're not going to correct this, we know what's going on, but hey, we need somewhere to put them. If we can completely down that number very far to only the children that actually should be removed, it would look so small in comparison to what we have.
Well, I have to find it, and I'll put the statistic up that 80% of children removed should not be removed right now. They did a study. 80% of children that are removed should never have been removed. But I have a question going back, and Dorothy's question. She wants to know who is in charge of the orphan trains. You guys
that's
know?
kind of the crazy part. Nobody was in charge of them. Basically, what they would do is they would basically provide cheap or free transportation to the kids, and they would just basically put them on trains. And then what they would do is they would go, as they would go through the cities, businesses and families would look at the kids and decide, you know, would this be a good fit in my family or for my current business, practice. And that was kind of how it worked. There was no organization to it exactly. It was kind of a free for all.
It was a societal idea that spread very quickly, that was a norm, but did not have a specific backing. And a lot of these times as well, they would take these children to very rural places and display them inside of a church lined up. Like, look, they want to know if they're strong enough, what their size is, are they childbearing.
So auctions.
So they would do that, and then the people would sort of, like bid to buy them, to take them home based on their physical attributes, if it was fitting for their needs. And the more people hear about this, that is that societal idea. The more people hear about that, they're like, yo, I can get a free kid sent to me. I get to pick it. Like, I get to power down because, my biological son just can't bale this hay. So
It's
Yeah,
like,
that's a good question. Dorothy's asking who paid for it. That part I didn't look into. So I don't know. Do you happen to know? I'm
um,
get
believe it would be to more, in each individual town, county area would be, people that didn't want homeless families or children's in their streets would start, okay, well, we can ship them.
so like
Or
a communal fund.
yeah, or the places where the kids were getting shipped to, like, they're shipping them because there's been a need that's been asked for. They're asking for a product, so on this end, we're giving it to them. I do have some belief that people started paying into a funding, like she said, that would get those kids there so that they could pick from them. So again, society was pitching in to this idea, as a whole.
But it was surprising to me because like this is kind of a forgotten part of our history.
They don't talk
And
too much.
Yeah, no,
yeah,
I think it was not forgotten, but like buried on purpose deeply because I'm reading it and I'm like wounded all over again. You
yeah,
think about after the horrible time period of slavery, now we're having like it all over again, but with our children,
yeah,
using our children, and
yeah.
then they're not even considered humans.
Hmm.
They don't get extended civil liberties and civil rights, and it's still happening.
Right.
I mean, I don't know
Yeah.
about orphan trains, but we do
Not
have.
a Or
We do have buses.
like mentally, we have orphan trains.
Oh, it is so. I mean, remember a year ago, Brian, that statistic from the FBI that 50% of the homes that were rated in human trafficking were foster care homes.
Yeah.
It's shocking.
And
Yeah.
then that same statistic, Homeland Security also confirmed on an overall scale that 80% of youth coming out of rings being found are from foster care. Not only being found in the home, but there's an
Mhm.
80% being found elsewhere that had been trafficked as well. And I wanted to say something real quick to what you said earlier. So to give everyone the exact statistic on the scale of 400, okay, we're surpassed 400,000. Some of that data is a little old and you need to look a little, I'll send out links a little more individualistically, but we actually have around 600,000 kids in foster care since COVID now. And
Oh, wow.
yes, so only 7% of 600,000 children are in foster care because of confirmed SA or physical abuse. That means a whole other majority, even when we talk about addiction, they still deserve reunification. I still consider that theft. So actual abuse to the child makes up only 7%. And that's not to say that children aren't abused. But what volume does it speak to you that plenty of abused children ask for help from CPS, but those children are not
Right,
taken when they should be?
right.
Hmm.
We have 7% of children in the world being heard and being placed into a system meant for them.
Hmm.
Right. Yeah. And
Um,
one of the things that I really hope that we're going to be able to talk about in a future episode is kind of what's going on there and why a lot of this is happening. And I know you've put together a lot of information on your own, Lee. And so I'm really excited for you to be able to talk about that in our next episode. But you were going to say something, Aaron.
I was just going to say I was working with a dependency court judge in Mississippi, and he, in his little teeny tiny town, the kids in foster care were 300. There was 300. That doesn't seem like a lot, but it's a lot for this little town. And in 1 year, he brought it down to 80 children, which is a huge like discrepancy. And because he stopped the immediate removals, removal should be the very last thing when there's no other choice. And I think that if you are, or if you have a drug problem or a drinking problem and you want to get better, you should be able to take your kids and go to a place and get better and still have your children. I don't think you should lose your children because you have a dependency issue. That doesn't seem, unless you are doing things that's going to hurt your child. But,
Mhm.
People come in here and they say, oh, there's a bottle of wine. Let me take your kid. Well, what if that was a present
Right.
at
And
Christmas?
that's getting into the next part of our whole conversation because
Mm-hmm.
that like by the 19th and 20th century, early 20th centuries, like the conversation about the poor started to change because at this point they were no longer talking about poverty as a result of moral failing, which at least they got that part right.
Mm-hmm.
Instead
One
it
thing,
was yeah, instead it was replaced with the new scientific belief that poverty was the result of genetics. And so this is where eugenics starts to to come into play. And so there was this organization that was called the American Breeders Association, which just sounds horrifying just by itself. It was founded in 1903. It was the first national eugenics organization in the United States. And it was when they basically started talking about how um, genetics played a role um, in the family. And so they would talk about things like people of color were essentially considered degenerates. And that, of course, like white people were sort of the cream of the crop, genetically superior. It was also at a period of time when they were starting to describe something that was called the feeble-minded mother, which I don't know if either of you know this conversation.
Women are still,
Yes, yes,
still labeled that today.
yes.
Oh, you need to stabilize your mental fitness. Oh,
Hmm.
she's mentally unfit. It's still, oh, she's a woman.
Yeah, but this is where this conversation started because what they basically decided was that women who were single, who were um, who had children, who maybe had had multiple sexual partners
Or rape.
or went into prostitution because there wasn't anything else for them to be
Mhm.
able to do at this period in
Mhm.
history. They were assessed as feeble-minded. And the idea was that these families were so genetically inferior that you couldn't rehabilitate them. That was the idea. And that was why they kind of moved away from this moral idea, was that they felt that the families could not be rehabilitated. So they thought the best thing to do was to place them permanently with foster families. And and in fact, like by 1908, they were starting to do what they called intelligence tests that were administered primarily on the feeble-minded poor.
The already undereducated that have no, they have
Right,
no, even basic education. They're going
right,
to do an education and
right.
it
And it was also based
already puts in
on
one direction, the
right,
scale.
right. And it was also based on white middle class European ideas. Well, I guess probably not middle class, but upper class ideals of what it meant to be intelligent. And so when they're administering these on families who are people of color or indigenous families, it often would skew towards this idea that they were feeble-minded. And so it basically, what they did with the kids at that time was they started removing them from the families because they first of all didn't think that they were capable of taking care of them, and then they started placing them in institutions, um, which were kind of like group homes, to segregate them from the population in order to make sure that they didn't they didn't interfere with uh, the genetic evolution of the United States population. And there was even like one of the very first organizations that was dedicated to um, foster foster care. Actually, this is where the term came from. There was a woman named E.K. Foster who was based out of Los Angeles, and she was a uh, community organizer, and she helped found the first children's bureau. And what they would actually do is there was a thing also at the time that was apparently really popular in like um, kind of like county fairs, things like that, is they would do they were called fitter family contests. Is also kind of where like beauty pageants came from, is that they were basically judging children based on their genetic superiority. And so the Children's Bureau was using that popularity of like these fitter family contests to essentially quote unquote provide a public health education on infant mortality prevention. And one of the ways that they were suggesting that you could prevent it was by essentially, if you were genetically inferior, removing yourself from the gene pool. And so they would do this either through um, recommendations that you not get married. And this is also where a lot of the laws regarding uh, interracial marriage came from. And they also would suggest that these families be deported so that they wouldn't import, they wouldn't pollute the gene pool. That was where a lot of this all came from. And it was kind of during this period of time when they were starting to use this idea of genetic superiority as a way to provide a rationalization from removal of kids and forced sterilization of what they called the feeble-minded mother. And there are hundreds of cases of this where women were basically sterilized in order to prevent them from having children because they were considered unfit. So
And who is now this is where I get a little, it's like, who are you to tell me that I'm unfit to raise my children? Like, when did that become, a popularity contest? And it's a rhetorical question, but like, who are you to say that I can't raise my child, or what I'm doing in my home is right or wrong? You don't live with me. You don't know our routine or my children. So it's like the audacity of
Yeah, and
what happened. Go ahead.
I think she froze.
Oh, like, they say something. They say something to me, and I'm like, what? Who are you?
Hmm.
Don't tell
Yeah.
me that reading tarot cards and practicing my spirituality is harming my child.
Right.
Because you're ignorant and closed-minded, that doesn't mean that it's how everybody is. So I just don't understand, like, when did everyone be like, okay, we're good with that. Let's just let these people take these kids away. We'll look the other way.
Right. Yeah, but this was kind of where, when you notice like how social workers often will come in with like different assessment tests and things like that in order to, this is where a lot of this started to happen,
Mm-hmm.
because they were using kind of the language of, it was essentially pseudoscience at the time. It's gotten better, but nonetheless, it's still, there are still issues with the way that they assess for these issues for.
And you can still pass all the assessments and
Right.
still lose your kid.
Right, because a lot of it is just based on
They don't
the
like your
whim.
face.
Yeah, they don't like your face, or as you noticed recently, they decide that your job is weird.
Yeah, my job is odd and weird.
Hmm. And that
My
was,
job is
yeah.
to help other families reunify. And that's odd and weird. I think you're odd and weird. I literally almost said that. I had to catch the words and put them back in my mouth. Yeah, that's when
But
the judge told me that he thinks that my job is odd and weird. It was, I could just visualize the words coming out of my, well, I think you're odd and weird. I had to, like, bring it back in, because I just,
yeah,
at that point, I had just had enough.
yes. So, but it was also kind of, this was also when one of the very first, like one of the most influential books on social casework came out. It was called Social Diagnosis. It was by a woman named Mary Richmond.
Mm-hmm.
And she actually encouraged social workers to assess for things like what she called moral degeneracy and feeble-mindedness. And it was recommended that families that were considered unfit, who were immigrants, be deported or institutionalized or sterilized, and that children who were genetically inferior would be placed in institutions rather than in foster care to prevent them from contaminating the gene pool.
Insane.
I know, yeah.
You know what kills me is when women hurt other women. Like, when women will do things, it's like, why are you tearing this mama down? You're a mama. Like, why are you making laws that are going to hurt other mothers instead of helping other mothers come out of poverty or come out of being uneducated? Like, when did this whole really, it's like, I know it's generational, but the fact that we're not lifting each other up is heartbreaking, especially as women. Like, why? What are we competing? Why are we being horrible to each other? I mean, as in society, it's humanity. There's nothing human and kind about mankind anymore.
Right.
You're
Yeah.
just taking babies.
Yes. I think Lee's trying to rejoin us if you want to check on that.
I keep
Um,
okay, there we
yeah.
go.
So,
We're
you
back.
back?
Yes, sorry, I wasn't sure what happened. I'm like sitting next to my router now.
We were having some technical difficulties earlier too, so
Yeah.
I wanted to jump in since I closed out and go backwards a little bit to what you were talking about, eugenics, those things, but also something that we started to see that I'm not sure a lot of people are aware of. But they started using loaner babies for universities, and there are a lot of children that
I forgot about that.
medical experiments, but they kind
Mhm.
of wanted to train young women how to be a mother, right? So these universities says this is the woman's place, and these young women need to be prepared to be mothers. So they would each take a turn with this infant, different people, part of the class and the group. I'll send you stuff on it.
Mhm.
And they would kind of flip flop the baby around until the baby was about a year old, and then placed with an adoptive or foster family. But we also saw that in terms of when they were evaluating stutters. They took a group of foster children that did have stutters and some that didn't, and tried to convince the children that didn't that they had one. They were doing weird little mental things. They were looking at
That's right, right-handed, like
they
mixed.
want to bonding is important. They would actually do experiments where they would purposefully neglect the child to see the effects that would come. And foster children still, and even starting then, were used as like free tests.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
they would put a baby in a crib and then just walk away and study it from another room to see how it would react. Well, what the fuck? How do you think it's going to react?
Or they'd purposely try to scare them. They had a
Right.
separate one where they were trying to see about what fear is. Did they correlate fear with this, or this? That
I
kind of.
makes me want to cry right now. I'm like holding it back thinking about those babies.
Wow. I did not
Yeah.
know any of this. So this
Yeah,
is wow.
I've done a lot of research, but
But yeah, by the end of the World War II, though, this conversation around foster care started changing again, and you can probably guess why eugenics fell out of favor. It was because it was associated with the Nazi Party, and they used the idea of eugenics to essentially mass exterminate a lot of the people that were in their concentration camps. And so at this point, then the conversation started shifting towards what was, quote, in the best interests of the child.
oh, I love that word.
Yes, isn't
That's
that a wonderful
nice as well.
phrase?
I know this sentence.
Yes, and so, like, for example, like in 1962, Henry Kemp first to start describe what was called the battered child syndrome, which is a very serious issue because it basically was a situation where he was noticing children that were receiving debilitating and life-threatening injuries because of their caregivers. And he was saying that and it's still true today, that about 2,000 children die each year as a result of these injuries. And
And sometimes
um,
it was already involved and did nothing. Just saying.
right. Yes, but this was also where social workers began using child abuse as a reason to justify removal from the home, was because they were trying to say that they didn't want, they were trying to say they didn't want them to be the victims of battered child syndrome.
Right. They had a good idea, and they started to have a good intention with their ideology. They kind of flipped it around. An intention. We're just gonna leave it at intention. But
Right. Yeah. And another thing that they started focusing on, kind of a same lines of behavior, was that they started looking at this is when research in the 1970s started coming out about multi-problem families. And this is still a term that's used, that is basically talking about different risk factors that can affect a family's functioning. And then also in 1989, they were, again, going back to that conversation earlier, the United Nations created what was called the Convention of the Rights of the Child, which required ratifying states to act in the best interests of the child. And you can guess why this was a problem and remains a problem, because what does it mean, best interests of the child?
it's such a loose term with lacking of definition.
Hmm.
The same way, if you do look in federal government, the way they word the immunity for a caseworker is very strange and very stagnant. That they're working in the best interest of the child on good faith, meaning that whatever they did, they truly believed it was the best interest of the child.
Yeah. And what's been interesting is that even though they've kind of changed the language around this, and so that it's not about genetics or morality anymore, it's about behavior and, symptoms, essentially, what they're using to define things like family fitness, and the best interest of the child really hasn't changed all that much, because they're still using things like poverty, drug use, criminal behavior,
Risk
and
of harm.
yeah.
Risk of harm is something most people, I don't think, realize the depth of what they use. So risk of harm would be I'm a prior foster youth, I'm a risk of harm. Not that I've harmed my child, I just potentially could harm my child because I've experienced trauma. And that's
Right.
kind of sometimes what they'll use with mental health. If they don't want to directly discriminate, they'll
Mhm.
instead go, there's a risk of harm.
Mhm. Right, and one of the things they also do is they focus primarily on families who are multi-problem families to conduct this research, and don't really look at how at it from a broader perspective of how it's are what's happening within families that are part of the general population. So, Um, so it became a real issue, and it still continues to be a problem. And one of the things that's also interesting is that when we look at things like one of the issues that comes up is parenting and how uh, that has an impact on the multi-problem family. And again, just like in the early 1900s and late 1800s, the research is focusing primarily on the mother and the mother's parenting of the children. There's only been kind of a recent um, focus on the father's impact on the kids, which is very strange because so much of the physical abuse that comes in families is coming from the father. Um, but um, but we also see that race continues to play a large role in removals. And you can see that because a lot of people are familiar with there's a law that was put in place in 1978 that basically prevented Native American children from being removed from their homes and placed with non-Native families. They had to be placed with Native American families. And one of the reasons that they did this was because before that law was put in place, about 75% of Native American children were removed from their homes and placed in foster care with non-Native families. And a big part of that was, again, going back to this whole issue of they were looking at multi-problem families. And one of the things that they were trying to show that was a test for a good, um, for a fit home was whether or not a kid had a strong bond with with at least one primary caregiver. And that wasn't how it worked in Native American families because they were raised by the tribe. They were.
And even today, it's Widka. It's the or Idka. I can't. I have to look it up. I should know because they didn't contact my tribe when they removed my daughter.
Mhm.
So my great grandfather was the chief of our tribe, and my great aunt sits on chief and council. So I know that they did not contact them. They assumed blonde hair, blue eyes, non-Native American.
Right.
So we're not going to bother asking. Then I got to court and the judge asked, and I said, yes, I am. And
Mhm.
the social worker didn't say. I said, nobody asked me. So
Mhm.
part of my lawsuit against DCFS is they didn't contact my tribe.
Right.
And they didn't, because there's special laws and special things that they have to do. And it's a whole pain in the butt. And they don't want to do it because you have
Right.
to get permission from the tribe.
Right. Right.
And then when they do remove from that household, they don't put into white families. They're supposed to stay with their spiritual community, with their cultural community. They're not supposed to be removed off of the reservation.
Right.
And
Yeah. Yeah. And even the law itself is starting to get eroded because there was a court case that came out called Adoptive Couple versus Baby Girl. That was basically, it got all the way to the Supreme Court, and they basically ruled that the father, who in this case he was Native American, his mom, his child's mom had basically asked him to give up his parental rights, and he thought it was basically so that um, you know that she would have primary custody of the child. But what she was doing was she wanted him to give up his parental rights so that so that she could um, give up the child and place it in adoption. And so it was placed with an adoptive family. And once he realized that, he put in a court case to basically say, like, no, I'm Native American, and this is not something that is allowed by law.
mm-hmm.
And the Supreme Court rejected that that argument, even though he was right in the case of the law.
Right.
So, but but yeah, there was, I mean, and it's not just Native Americans, because we've noticed that, like, again, kind of going back to this idea of what is a suitable home or a fit family or what's in the best interest of the child. In the 1960s, there was there was a aid to dependent children program that had been in place, I want to say, since 1935. But during the 1960s, they were basically denying funding because there was a provision in the financial assistance program that would only provide funding to quote unquote suitable homes. And so that affected about 79 out of every 1,000 children in need. And it was primarily being targeted at Black families.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, you've seen my home.
Mm-hmm.
DCFS said that my house was unfit.
Yes.
So what is the level? What are the standards of unfit? Because my house is beautiful. I have a lovely.
Your house is gorgeous. Your house should be like in a Better Homes and Gardens magazine. It's like amazing.
So there's like, oh, this is unfit. Well, by who? Because why? Because you're jealous that my backyard's prettier than yours, or And then they said that my daughter's room was unfit, and it's their burden of proof. I think needs to change. I think it needs to go up to where you have to prove someone murdered somebody before you should take away their child. Right. Not this clear and convincing evidence standard. They don't even have the preponderance of truth. It's clear and convincing. They just go off of hearsay or whatever the neighbor says. You get in a fight with your neighbor, watch out.
Right. And I mean, I've even read the jurisdictional reports that are that come from my some of my clients that I've had to work with in therapy. And it'll be like it'll start with like the police investigation, and they'll say this is what basically happened, and the parent will have a piece in there about kind of what was reported.
Wait a minute, Dorothy, me too. They came, they checked my house, they said, we feel confident nothing's going to happen to your daughter. We are good to go with you. No problems here. Goodbye. Have a nice day. Sorry to waste your time. And then they took her without a warrant a couple of days later.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, 31 days after my attempted suicide, they came and removed her. But when they did the investigation, everything was fine and dandy to my face. And then I get the report and it's, oh, my house is unfit and, mental stability, all these things that had to be knocked out one by one. But it seems to be the standard of what's happening.
Right. And again, it's kind of coming from this whole like past history with like the eugenics, which is the idea that families are not fit to genetically to raise their kids, and so they need to be placed with someone else. They need to be placed in foster care. And and again, kind of going back to that argument and kind of talking again about the racism that's still inherent in the system, is that like African American children represent about a third of the foster care population, despite only representing about 15% of the entire child population. And so they are more than doubly represented within the foster care system. And there's really no explanation for that except for systemic racism that is involved in this whole process. And but I was going to going back to the jurisdictional reports that I've read, it'll be like everything is in lockstep until I get to the social workers report, and then it is just like Looney Tunes and based on seriously. And based on their reports, you can see why they were removed, because it sounds like this was like a terrible environment. But so often that's what
right here.
Yeah, that's what the judge will use to determine whether or not the child should remain placed in the family, because they assume that the social workers have the best interests of the child in mind. And there are any myriad of reasons why they maybe don't. And one of them, again, being racism, but there's also other issues that could be within the foster system itself. Which was that, it's kind of along the lines of, you don't want to be the one who sent them back to an abusive family. And so you just try to find anything or any reason that you can to remove them. And
they will make shit up too.
Yeah,
absolutely. No proof, doesn't matter. They've been caught lying under oath, and and they get promoted.
Yes. Yeah. And so it is a big problem,
Mm.
and it continues to remain a big problem. And what's what's even more crazy making is that there is research out now that is starting to show that the way the foster care system is designed is really not in the best interest of the child.
No.
Because removal of them from their homes does not result in any increase in overall function. In fact, there's a lot of research that's suggesting quite the opposite, that kids who are in foster care do worse overall than children who are. The best that you can find is that there's really no difference.
This is all they give you if you're lucky when they remove your child. It's like the court process, blah, 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 blah. You're taking my baby away and you're going to give me a pamphlet? They don't want you to get your children back, or they would not be giving you this.
Right. Right.
There's 4 things on here. And this was for San Bernardino County, for my county.
Oh, geez. Yeah.
And all it is where are my children? And they don't tell you.
Mm-hmm.
When can I visit my children? Who do I contact? And then how do I get my children back? And the last one, how do I get my children back? Your attorney will provide you with your options for today's court hearing. After today, your new social worker will meet with you to work on a plan for your family.
Yeah. Yeah. Lee mentions in the comments down here that she was messed up for years, that foster care hurt her more than being taken away, and that is not uncommon. 33% of children who are in foster care have reported some form of abuse during their placement at the hands of either their foster care provider or another adult who's in the home. And the other thing that is just staggering is that girls who are in group homes are 28 times more likely to experience sexual abuse than the general population. Yeah. And like Aaron was saying earlier in the show, was that 50% of children who are recovered in police raids for sex trafficking, child sex trafficking, were placed in the foster care system. So it's become essentially a funnel for child prostitution, sex trafficking.
Man.
Yeah. And so the system is not helping the kids. And a lot of times what we talk about within like psychological and social service the communities is wanting to do better in terms of screening. But the real question is if it's not doing better than just having them placed in the same home, and it could be potentially worse, then why are we continuing to use this system at all?
Let's not glaze over the fact that the removal is so traumatic.
Oh gosh, yes.
To children and to parents. And then you want to know why they're acting up, or they're wetting the bed, or when they're crying, and you're like, what? You've just removed them, and you're not allowed to talk to them about it. You're not allowed to tell your children what are happening. You're not allowed to answer any questions, which is ludicrous. But when that happens, they just take your kid and then don't tell your children what happens. And then you get in trouble if your kid starts acting out.
Right. And in fact, there's diagnoses that are in the DSM-5, the official DSM-5, that are specifically related to kids who've been through the foster care system. It's reactive attachment disorder and disinhibited social engagement disorder. And basically what happens in those situations is that because they were placed in the foster care system, and that attachment to their parents was disrupted, they develop these symptoms of either avoiding everybody or basically glomming onto anybody who they think might be able to provide them with some care. And it is horrifying, some of the things that I've seen in terms of kids who've been placed in the foster care system. There was a client I had who would actually self-injure herself. She was 4, and she would self-injure herself because that was what she had learned when she was living in a group home would get her needs met.
Right.
And once she started to realize that she didn't need to do that anymore, those behaviors stopped. but that's kind of what happens with the foster care system. And so why are we using this system that is based in classism, eugenicism, racism, to
Sexism,
continue, yeah, sexism, to continue this,
all
what
the
is,
isms.
yes, to essentially continue what is abuse of these children,
Mhm.
um, and doing very little to prevent it, even though they're placed with what we consider to be homes that are in the best interest of the child. So,
Well, real quick, before in Riverside here,
mhm.
there was the Riverside County DCFS office got shut down
Mm.
because the 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 caseworkers and their bosses, they all knew that there was a pedophile as a foster parent for 12 years happening. And they
Wow.
all knew it. They all knew he was a pedophile. They all knew it. And they looked the other way.
Wow.
So, exactly. Why are we allowing this to happen? And
Mhm.
my thing is, I always say, is that until the people that are unaffected by this,
Mhm.
nothing's going to change.
Right.
So we need to make our voices louder, and
Mm.
because until the unaffected are affected, there's
Mhm.
not going to be any change.
Right.
Like I didn't know. I had no idea. I thought CPS, ooh, you're a bad parent. I thought that they have this angel syndrome or this
Mhm.
survivor or this savior thing, and I had no idea how horrible it was. If I would have known
Mhm.
as growing up, I would have voted differently. I would have, gone and to rallies and to
Right.
protests and made change for legislation locally. But I had
Right.
no idea. I thought, oh, CPS is good. No,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah, that was my experience too. When I got into working in mental health care, I started seeing clients, and they were doing their case plans. They had good places for their kids to live. They had done everything, and in some cases they had done it multiple times.
Hmm.
And for any of a variety of just wacky reasons, they were still being denied their the rights of their kids, and even in some cases, those kids were being put up for adoption because they've been in the foster care system for so long.
Yeah.
And that's a conversation that
For our
I
next
think
show.
for our next show, and Lee will have some information regarding that. And so I'm really excited that we can talk about that and kind of understand what Aaron was saying, which is why they aren't reuniting kids with their families and why that doesn't seem to be a priority, even though they say it is. It
Right.
only
It's
happens at
not
about,
anywhere near even a
yeah,
thought in their mind. First thing
yeah,
first, remove.
yeah. And they say it's supposed to be 90% of cases are reunified, but the actual
No way.
statistics, it's closer to, like, it's less than 50%.
Hmm.
So, um, so yeah, so that's something that we definitely want to talk about in our next episode. So,
If
but
you guys want to come on and tell your stories with us,
mhm.
feel free to email us and we will get to you and someone will contact you. But remember, it's just us two. So, but we
Yeah.
would love to have you guys come on and talk about what's happened to you.
Mhm.
And if you guys need help, I'm really good at reunification and or supervised visitation with DCFS. Lee's Lee's got quite a story, and hopefully we can start bringing awareness to what's happening. And
Yeah.
I'm glad that we started this.
Yeah. And just kind of seconding that, there should be, I'll have to look and see if it's still there, if I have posted it yet, but I'll if it's not there now, I'll definitely put up a link to a page where you can just give us your contact information. We can reach out to you and see if we can bring you on the show. So anyway, but well, thank you everybody for listening. My name is Brian Hamilton. Again, I'm an AMFT, associate marriage family therapist in Rancho Cucamonga. I work for my Serenity Mental Wellness. And Aaron.
My screen's moving around, and that's weird. My name is Erin Carranza, and I am the founder of Transformation Through Unification. And if you guys need help, just find me on Facebook or my website. I forgot I have one.
Yes. So
So
anyway,
thank you guys.
yeah,
Until
thank you very much for joining us, and you all take care.
bye
Bye.
bye.